What if a king, once crowned with divine authority, could be stripped of everything his throne, his dignity, even his humanity, in a death so horrific it would be whispered about for centuries? Welcome to the dark and tragic tale of King Edward II of England, a monarch whose reign was marred by scandal, betrayal, and ultimately, an end so gruesome it defies imagination. In the early 14th century, a time of brutal politics and unrelenting power struggles, Edward II's story is not just one of a fallen king, but of a man whose very body became a battlefield for vengeance. History books often gloss over the chilling details, but we won't shy away from the truth. What drove his enemies to orchestrate such an unthinkable murder? How could a king's death become a symbol of both cruelty and caution? Stay with us as we unravel a narrative far darker and more complex than you might expect, a story of ambition, treachery, and a final act so shocking it still haunts the annals of history. In the early 14th century, England was a realm of raw power and unrelenting ambition, a land where the crown was both a divine blessing and a deadly burden. The year was 1307 when Edward II ascended to the throne, inheriting a kingdom already fractured by war, debt, and discontent from his father, Edward I, known as the Hammer of the Scots for his ruthless campaigns against Scotland. Edward I had been a towering figure, a warrior, king who expanded English dominance and instilled fear in his enemies. His son, however, was a stark contrast to man, whose interests lay not in the battlefield, but in personal pleasures and questionable alliances. Born in 1284 at Caernarfon Castle in Wales, Edward II was the first English prince to hold the title of Prince of Wales, a symbolic gesture of his father's conquests. Yet, from the outset, whispers of inadequacy followed him. He was not the son his father had hoped for, lacking the martial prowess and iron will that defined Edward I's reign. Instead, young Edward was drawn to music, poetry, and most controversially, the company of certain men who would shape his destiny and his doom. The political landscape of England during Edward II's reign was a cauldron of tension. The barons, powerful nobles who controlled vast swaths of land and private armies, were a constant thorn in the monarchy's side. They demanded influence over the king's decisions, resenting any perceived weakness or mismanagement. Edward I had kept them in check through sheer force of will, but his son struggled to command the same respect. The kingdom was also financially crippled, drained by endless wars with Scotland and France, part of the broader struggle for dominance in the British Isles and on the European continent. The English treasury was near empty, and Edward II inherited a debt that seemed insurmountable. Taxes were high, the peasantry grumbled under the weight of feudal obligations, and famine loomed as a recurring specter due to poor harvests and harsh winters. In this volatile environment, a king needed to be a unifier, a strategist, and above all, a leader. Edward II, unfortunately, was none of these things, at least not in the eyes of those who mattered most. Central to Edward's story is his relationship with Piers Gaveston, a Gascon knight who became the king's closest companion, and many believed, his lover. Gaveston was a charismatic and ambitious figure, introduced to Edward when they were young by Edward I himself, who had hoped the knight would be a positive influence. Instead, their bond grew into something far more personal, scandalizing the court and enraging the barons. Homosexuality, though not explicitly criminalized at the time, was viewed with deep suspicion and moral disdain in medieval society, especially for a king whose duty was to produce heirs and embody masculine strength. Edward's open favoritism toward Gaveston, showering him with titles, lands, and influence, alienated the nobility, who saw the knight as an upstart foreigner unworthy of such power. Gaveston's arrogance only fueled their hatred. He mocked the barons with nicknames and flaunted his position as the king's confidant. Edward I had exiled Gaveston once before his death, sensing the danger of their relationship, but upon ascending the throne, Edward II recalled him immediately, defying both his father's wishes and political wisdom. This act set the tone for a reign defined by personal loyalty over pragmatic governance. Equally significant in Edward's life was his queen, Isabella of France, often later dubbed the She-Wolf of France for her fierce determination. Isabella, daughter of King Philip IV of France, married Edward in 1308 as part of a diplomatic alliance to secure peace between the two nations. She was just 12 at the time, a child thrust into a foreign court while Edward was 23 and already deeply attached to Gaveston. The marriage was doomed from the start. Edward's neglect of Isabella evident even at their wedding, where he paid more attention to Gaveston than to his bride sowed seeds of resentment that would grow into a deadly harvest. Isabella, though young, was no mere pawn. She was intelligent, politically astute, and fiercely proud of her royal blood. Over time, her humiliation at Edward's hands, coupled with her exclusion from power, turned her into a formidable adversary. But in these early years, she remained in the background, bearing Edward's children 4 in total, including the future Edward III, while the king's obsession with Gaveston dominated the court. Beyond personal relationships, Edward II's reign was marked by military failures that further eroded his authority. The ongoing war with Scotland, led by the indomitable Robert the Bruce, was a festering wound. Edward I had nearly crushed Scottish resistance, but under Edward II, the tide turned. The disastrous Battle of Bannockburn in 1314 was a humiliating defeat for the English, where Bruce's smaller, tactically superior forces routed Edward's army. The king barely escaped with his life, fleeing the battlefield while his troops were slaughtered. This loss not only emboldened the Scots, but also shattered Edward's credibility among his own nobles, who blamed his poor leadership and lack of military acumen. The barons, already frustrated by Gaveston's influence, began to see Edward as a liability, a king who could neither win wars nor manage his own court. Their discontent simmered, waiting for the right moment to boil over into open rebellion. The stage was thus set for a reign that would spiral into chaos. Edward II, caught between his personal desires and the crushing demands of kingship, seemed oblivious to the storm gathering around him. His devotion to Piers Gaveston blinded him to the political realities of his court, while his strained marriage to Isabella created a rift that would prove catastrophic. The barons, hungry for power and resentful of royal weakness, watched and waited, their loyalty fraying with each misstep. England, already battered by war and hardship, could ill afford a king who prioritized personal bonds over national stability. As the years passed, these tensions would build into a crescendo of betrayal and violence, leading to a downfall so brutal that it would echo through history as a grim reminder of the price of power and the cost of losing it. As the years of Edward II's reign unfolded, the cracks in his rule widened into chasms, fueled by envy, betrayal, and a relentless struggle for power that threatened to tear England apart. The king's unyielding favoritism toward Piers Gaveston had already alienated the barons, but it was his refusal to heed their grievances that transformed simmering resentment into outright rebellion. Gaveston, ever the provocateur, reveled in his position as the king's closest confidant, wielding influence far beyond what his status as a mere knight warranted. He was made Earl of Cornwall, a title of immense prestige, and given control over key decisions, often sidelining the traditional nobility. The barons, men of ancient lineage and fierce pride, could not stomach this affront. They saw Gaveston not just as an interloper, but as a symptom of Edward's weakness, a king who ruled with his heart rather than his head. Their whispers of discontent grew into roars, and by 1310, the situation reached a breaking point. A coalition of powerful nobles, led by figures like Thomas of Lancaster, Edward's own cousin, demanded reforms and the exile of Gaveston, forcing the king to confront the limits of his authority. Edward, however, was not a man to bend easily when it came to his beloved companion. Though he initially agreed to the barons' demands under pressure, including the creation of the Ordinances of 1311, a set of laws designed to curb royal power and banish, Gaveston's compliance was superficial at best. The ordinances were a humiliating blow, stripping Edward of much of his autonomy and placing governance in the hands of a baronial council. Yet, within months, Edward defied the agreement, recalling Gaveston from exile and reinstating him at court. This act of defiance was a declaration of war against the nobility, a reckless gamble that showed how deeply personal loyalty trumped political wisdom in Edward's mind. The barons, incensed by this betrayal of their trust, took matters into their own hands. In 1312, they captured Gaveston after a brief siege at Scarborough Castle, where Edward had left him for safety. What followed was a brutal act of vengeance. Gaveston was dragged before a makeshift tribunal, denied a proper trial, and executed on Blacklow Hill in Warwickshire. His death was not just the murder of a man, but a direct challenge to the king's authority, a message written in blood that Edward could not ignore. The loss of Gaveston shattered Edward on a personal level, plunging him into grief and rage, but it did little to mend the fractured relationship with his barons. If anything, it deepened the divide. Edward vowed revenge against those responsible, particularly Thomas of Lancaster, whom he blamed for orchestrating the killing. Yet, without Gaveston, the king seemed adrift, lacking the emotional anchor that had guided so much of his reign. The barons, emboldened by their success, grew more assertive, believing they could control or even replace a monarch they deemed unfit. Meanwhile, Edward's military failures continued to haunt him. The defeat at Bannockburn in 1314, already a stain on his legacy, lingered as a symbol of his inadequacy. Scotland's Robert the Bruce capitalized on England's disarray, launching raids into northern England with impunity, further humiliating Edward and draining the kingdom's resources. The king's inability to secure the borders or rally his nobles for a unified defense only fueled perceptions of his incompetence, turning even moderate allies against him. Into this void of leadership stepped another figure who would come to dominate Edward's life, Hugh Despenser the Younger. Despenser, a nobleman from a family with a history of royal service, emerged as Edward's new favorite in the late 1310s, filling the emotional and political gap left by Gaveston. Like his predecessor, Despenser was ambitious, cunning, and deeply unpopular with the barons. Edward's attachment to him mirrored the obsession with Gaveston, though Despenser proved even more ruthless in consolidating power. Appointed as chamberlain, he gained control over royal finances and lands, often at the expense of other nobles whose properties he seized through dubious legal means. His greed and arrogance made enemies at every turn, but Edward, blinded by loyalty or perhaps something deeper, protected him at all costs. This new alliance reignited the barons' fury, as they saw history repeating itself, a king once again prioritizing a single man over the needs of the realm. The Despensers, both Hugh the Younger and his father, Hugh the Elder, became symbols of corruption, their influence over Edward a constant reminder of his inability to govern impartially. The rising conflict was not confined to the court alone. It seeped into Edward's personal life, most notably in his deteriorating relationship with Queen Isabella. By the early 1320s, Isabella had endured years of neglect and humiliation, forced to watch as her husband lavished attention and resources on men like Gaveston and now Despenser. Her role as queen was reduced to a ceremonial one, her voice ignored in matters of state. The final straw came when Edward, under Despenser's influence, confiscated some of Isabella's lands and income, stripping her of financial independence. This was not just a personal slight, but a public declaration of her irrelevance. Isabella, a woman of royal blood and fierce intellect, could no longer tolerate such indignity. Her resentment turned to cold, calculated anger, and she began to forge alliances of her own, seeking support among the disaffected barons and even looking beyond England's shores for aid. Her marriage, once a mere inconvenience to Edward, was becoming a dangerous liability, as Isabella's wounded pride transformed her into a potential enemy of the crown. The kingdom stood on the edge of chaos. The barons, led by Lancaster and others, clashed with Edward and the Despensers in a series of skirmishes and political maneuvers known as the Despenser War of 1321, 1322. Edward, for once, emerged victorious, crushing the rebellion and executing Lancaster in a brutal display of retribution. But this triumph was hollow. It only deepened the hatred of his enemies and sowed seeds of further dissent. The king's reliance on the Despensers grew, alienating even those who had once been loyal. Across the Channel, Isabella watched and waited, her patience wearing thin. The stage was set for a dramatic unraveling, as personal betrayals and political intrigues intertwined, pushing Edward II closer to a precipice from which there would be no return. England, battered by internal strife and external threats, could not withstand much more of this turmoil, and the king, whether he realized it or not, was running out of time. By 1326, the once mighty King Edward II of England found himself teetering on the brink of utter ruin, his reign crumbling under the weight of betrayal and rebellion. The man who had once sat upon the throne with divine right was now a hunted figure, his power stripped away by the very forces he had long ignored. The catalyst for this dramatic fall was none other than his own queen, Isabella, who, after years of humiliation and marginalization, had transformed from a neglected consort into a formidable adversary. Exiled to France under the pretext of diplomatic negotiations, Isabella had forged an alliance with Roger Mortimer, a disgraced English baron who had escaped Edward's wrath after the Despenser War. Together they plotted the king's downfall, raising a small but determined army with the support of Isabella's brother, King Charles IV of France, and disaffected English nobles. When they landed on English soil in September 1326, their invasion was less a battle and more a tidal wave of discontent, as barons and commoners alike flocked to their cause, weary of Edward's mismanagement and the Despensers' tyranny. The king, abandoned by most of his supporters, fled westward with Hugh Despenser the Younger, desperately seeking refuge, but his fate was already sealed. Edward's capture in November 1326 near Llantrisant in South Wales marked the beginning of a harrowing descent into degradation. Betrayed by those he trusted, he was seized along with Despenser by forces loyal to Isabella and Mortimer. The king, who had once wielded absolute authority, was now a prisoner, stripped of his royal trappings and reduced to a mere man at the mercy of his enemies. Despenser, his last loyal companion, faced a gruesome end almost immediately. Tried for treason, he was subjected to a public execution in Hereford, where he was hanged, drawn, and quartered, his body desecrated as a warning to others. Edward, witnessing the brutal fate of his confidant, must have felt the cold grip of dread tighten around him. He was not killed outright, however. Isabella and Mortimer had other plans. They needed to legitimize their coup, and so Edward was forced to abdicate the throne in January 1327 in favor of his young son, Edward III, under the guise of a voluntary resignation. The scene at Kenilworth Castle, where this abdication took place, was one of profound humiliation. Edward, clad in black, wept as he relinquished his crown, his voice breaking with the weight of his loss. It was a moment of public shame, orchestrated to break his spirit before an audience of nobles who had once sworn fealty to him. Following his abdication, Edward was no longer a king but a prisoner, his title reduced to Edward of Caernarfon, a hollow echo of his birthright. He was moved from Kenilworth to Berkeley Castle in Gloucestershire, a grim fortress far from the eyes of the court, where his captors could control every aspect of his existence. Here, under the custody of Thomas de Berkeley and John Maltravers, Edward's decline accelerated into a nightmare of physical and psychological torment. Historical accounts, though varied in detail, paint a picture of deliberate cruelty designed to crush what remained of his dignity. The once proud monarch was confined to a dank, cramped cell, likely in the castle's dungeon, where the air was thick with dampness and the walls echoed with silence or the distant clatter of his jailers. Food and water were rationed, barely enough to sustain life, and some sources suggest he was fed spoiled or meager rations as a form of slow starvation. His royal garments were replaced with tattered rags, a symbolic stripping of his identity, while his personal hygiene was neglected, leaving him to wallow in filth. This was no mere imprisonment. It was a calculated effort to dehumanize him, to erase the memory of his kingship from both his mind and the minds of any who might still harbor loyalty to him. The psychological toll of this imprisonment was as brutal as the physical. Edward, isolated from the world, had no allies, no news of his family, and no hope of rescue. Rumors persist that his captors taunted him with false promises of release or fabricated reports of rebellion in his name, only to dash his hopes with cruel laughter. He was a man who had once commanded armies and presided over a kingdom, now reduced to pleading for mercy from men who reveled in his despair. Some chroniclers of the time, like Geoffrey Le Baker, later wrote of Edward's mental anguish, describing how he would cry out in the night, haunted by the ghosts of his past decisions and the loss of everything he held dear. Whether these accounts are entirely accurate or tinged with dramatic embellishment, they reflect a broader truth. Edward's imprisonment was not just about containing his body but destroying his soul. The goal was clear: to ensure that even if he lived, he would never again be a threat, never again inspire loyalty or rebellion. Yet even this level of suffering was not enough for those who now held power. Isabella and Mortimer, though publicly presenting themselves as restorers of order with young Edward III as their figurehead, could not risk the possibility of Edward II's restoration. A living ex-king was a dangerous symbol, a potential rallying point for dissenters. As the months dragged on into the summer of 327. Whispers of plots to free Edward reached their ears, whether real or imagined. His continued existence became an intolerable liability. The decision was made, though never openly acknowledged, to end his life, but not in a way that could be easily traced back to the new regime. What followed would become one of the most infamous episodes in English history, a descent into cruelty so extreme that it would be spoken of in hushed tones for centuries. Edward's imprisonment at Berkeley Castle was no longer just a prelude to his demise. It was the stage for a final, horrific act of vengeance that would ensure his silence forever. In the shadowed depths of Berkeley Castle, during the late summer of 1327, the final chapter of Edward II's tragic life unfolded with a brutality that would sear itself into the annals of history. The once king, now a broken prisoner, had endured months of degradation, starvation, isolation, and relentless psychological torment at the hands of his captors, Thomas de Berkeley and John Maltravers. Yet even this suffering paled in comparison to the fate that awaited him. Isabella of France and her lover, Roger Mortimer, who now wielded power behind the throne of young Edward III, could no longer tolerate the risk of Edward's continued existence. A living ex-king, even one as shattered as Edward, remained a potential focal point for rebellion, a symbol of legitimacy that threatened their fragile grip on England. The decision to end his life was inevitable, but the manner of his death would be anything but ordinary. It was to be a murder so gruesome, so deliberately cruel, that it would serve as both a silencing of the past and a warning to the future, cloaked in enough ambiguity to shield the perpetrators from outright blame. On or around the 21st of September, 1327, though the exact date remains a matter of historical debate, Edward's tormentors enacted their final plan. The accounts of what transpired in that dank, stone-walled cell at Berkeley Castle vary across medieval chronicles, but the most widely circulated and chilling narrative comes from later sources like Geoffrey Le Baker's Chronicle, written decades after the event. According to this account, Edward was restrained, likely bound or held down by his jailers, as they prepared an act of unimaginable cruelty. The method chosen for his murder was not a swift blade or a quiet poison, but a grotesque and symbolic violation of his body, designed to leave no visible marks of violence that could incite outrage or suspicion of foul play. The story, though debated by modern historians for its veracity, describes how a red-hot iron or poker was inserted into Edward's body through his anus, burning his internal organs in a slow, excruciating death. The screams that must have echoed through the castle's cold corridors would have been harrowing, a sound of pure agony as the life was seared out of him. This method, if true, was not merely a means of killing but a deliberate desecration, a punishment laden with medieval notions of shame and retribution, possibly tied to rumors of Edward's homosexuality, a final, vicious insult to his dignity. The horror of this act cannot be overstated. Edward, already weakened by months of malnutrition and despair, would have had no strength to resist as his body was subjected to such torture. The pain would have been beyond comprehension, a burning torment that consumed him from within, each moment stretching into an eternity of suffering. If the accounts are accurate, his death was not instantaneous. It was a prolonged ordeal, a calculated cruelty meant to maximize his anguish. Some chroniclers suggest that the choice of this method was symbolic, a perverse reflection of the personal scandals that had defined his reign, while others argue it was simply a way to kill without leaving external wounds, allowing his death to be reported as natural or accidental. Indeed, when news of Edward's passing was announced, the official story was vaguesome, said he died of illness or grief, a convenient lie to mask the truth. His body was displayed publicly at Gloucester Abbey for a time, ostensibly to prove he was dead, though no close examination was permitted, fueling speculation even then that something sinister had occurred. Alternative theories about Edward's death have persisted through the centuries, adding layers of mystery to an already dark tale. Some historians and contemporary accounts suggest he may have been smothered or strangled, a less sensational but equally brutal end. Others, drawing on later rumors, propose even more outlandish methods of murder, though these lack credible evidence. A few sources, including a controversial letter known as the Fieschi letter from the 1330s, claim Edward did not die at all, that he escaped or was spirited away. living out his days in obscurity while a substitute body was presented. While intriguing, most modern scholars dismiss this as wishful thinking or propaganda, noting that the weight of evidence points to his death at Berkeley Castle. Regardless of the exact method, the consensus remains that Edward's end was neither natural nor merciful. It was a deliberate act of violence, orchestrated by those who stood to gain from his permanent silence. The emotional weight of Edward's death is as staggering as the physical horror. This was a man who, despite his flaws, had been anointed king, a figure believed to be chosen by God to rule. To see him reduced to a tortured shell, his body violated in the most degrading manner, was a profound desecration of that sacred ideal. His final moments, whether marked by screams or silent resignation, must have been haunted by the ghosts of his pastless father's disapproval, the loss of Piers Gaveston, the betrayal of his queen, and the collapse of his kingdom. There was no dignity in his death, no noble last stand or poignant farewell, only pain, humiliation, and the cold realization that he had been utterly forsaken. For Isabella and Mortimer, his murder was a necessary evil, a means to secure their power. But for Edward, it was the ultimate betrayal, the final proof that even the divine right of kings could not shield him from the cruelty of men. As news of his death spread carefully curated by those in power to avoid suspicion, the kingdom stood at a crossroads. Edward II was gone, his reign ending not with a battle or a decree, but with a whispered horror in a forgotten cell. Yet, the echoes of his demise would reverberate far beyond the walls of Berkeley Castle, shaping the future of England and the legacy of those who orchestrated his fall. His son, Edward III, now sat on the throne, a boy king under the shadow of his mother and her lover, unaware of the full extent of the brutality that had cleared his path. But history would not forget, nor would it forgive, the unthinkable end of a king whose life had been as tragic as his death was gruesome. The gruesome death of Edward II in September 1327 at Berkeley Castle did not mark the end of his story, but rather the beginning of a new chapter of intrigue, power struggles, and historical reckoning that would shape England for generations. In the immediate aftermath, Isabella of France and Roger Mortimer, the architects of Edward's downfall, solidified their control over the kingdom through the young Edward III, who was just 14 at the time of his father's death. Officially, Edward II's passing was attributed to natural causes or illness, a flimsy narrative meant to quell suspicion and maintain the illusion of legitimacy for the new regime. His body was buried with some ceremony at Gloucester Abbey, now Gloucester Cathedral, a tomb that still stands today, adorned with an effigy that portrays a serene and regal king, a stark contrast to the horror of his final moments. Yet whispers of murder persisted among the nobility and common folk alike, fueled by the secrecy surrounding his imprisonment and the refusal to allow close inspection of his body. These rumors, though suppressed, planted seeds of doubt about Isabella and Mortimer's rule, casting a shadow over their authority from the outset. Isabella, once the humiliated queen, now reveled in her role as the de facto ruler alongside Mortimer, who was elevated to unprecedented power, even daring to style himself as a near king. Their partnership, however, was built on fragile ground. The barons, though initially supportive of the coup against Edward II, grew resentful of Mortimer's arrogance and Isabella's dominance, seeing in them the same flaws they had despised in Edward and his favorites. More critically, young Edward III, as he matured, began to chafe under their control, aware of the whispers about his father's fate and the stain it left on his own legitimacy. In 1330, just 3 years after Edward II's death, the young king staged a dramatic coup of his own, arresting Mortimer during a midnight raid at Nottingham Castle with the help of loyal nobles. Mortimer was tried and executed for treason, his body hanged at Tyburn as a public spectacle, while Isabella was spared but forced into retirement at Castle Rising in Norfolk, stripped of her political influence. Edward III's assertion of power marked a turning point, as he sought to distance himself from the scandals of his parents' reigns and forge a new legacy, one that would eventually see him become one of England's most celebrated warrior kings. The legacy of Edward II's reign and death, however, was not so easily erased. His murder, if indeed it occurred as the most infamous accounts suggest, became a cautionary tale in medieval politics, a grim reminder of the vulnerability of even anointed kings when they lost the loyalty of their subjects. Chroniclers of the time and later centuries grappled with how to portray him, often painting Edward as a weak and flawed ruler whose personal failings invited divine retribution, while others hinted at the monstrous injustice of his end. The story of the red-hot poker, though possibly exaggerated or invented by later writers like Geoffrey Le Baker to symbolize moral judgment, became the dominant narrative, embedding itself in popular imagination as a symbol of ultimate cruelty. Over time, Edward's reign was overshadowed by the successes of his son, Edward III, and the later drama of the Wars of the Roses, relegating him to a footnote in many historical accounts. Yet, his tomb at Gloucester became a site of quiet pilgrimage, and by the late Middle Ages, some even spoke of miracles associated with it, suggesting a posthumous rehabilitation of his image among certain circles who saw him as a martyr to political machination. In modern historiography, Edward II's story has been revisited with greater nuance, as scholars debate the accuracy of the medieval accounts of his death and the motivations behind them. Some argue that the poker story was a fabrication meant to tarnish Isabella and Mortimer's reputations, or to underscore Edward's supposed moral failings, while others maintain that such a method, though horrific, was not beyond the realm of possibility in a brutal age. Questions also linger about whether Edward truly died in 1327, with fringe theories like the Fieschi letter suggesting he survived in obscurity. Though most historians dismiss these as romantic speculation, what remains undeniable is the tragedy of his Lysa king caught between personal desires and the crushing demands of medieval monarchy, whose weaknesses were exploited by those closest to him. His relationship with Piers Gaveston, and later Hugh Despenser, once a source of scandal, is now often examined through a lens of personal identity, prompting discussions about sexuality and power in the Middle Ages. Edward II, in this light, emerges not just as a failed ruler, but as a deeply human figure, flawed yet pitiable, whose suffering transcended the political to touch on universal themes of betrayal and loss. As we reflect on this dark chapter of history, one question lingers like a shadow over Berkeley Castle's ancient stones. Could Edward II's fate have been different, or was his downfall an inevitable collision of personal frailty and political ruthlessness? His story is not merely a tale of a king's murder, but a mirror held up to the brutal realities of power, where loyalty is fleeting and mercy is a luxury few can afford. The echoes of his screams, if they indeed rang out in that fateful cell, remind us of the cost of ambition, the fragility of crowns, and the enduring human capacity for cruelty. What do you think? Does Edward II deserve to be remembered as a victim of his time, or as the architect of his own destruction? Share your thoughts with us as we continue to unravel the mysteries of history's most haunting tales, seeking not just answers, but the deeper truths they reveal about who we are.